Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you this morning, and I hope we can have an enjoyable 90 minutes or so together. I'm going to talk a bit about my work, but I'm also going to try and provide a response to what you think you've signed up for, which is a talk on assessing threats to validity and the implications for impact evaluation findings. Some of this, of necessity, will be a bit conceptual, but I don't want that to be understood in a pejorative sense. I think we need to have frameworks for understanding things, and when we have tools that we want to deploy, when we're trying to get an empirical handle on the very difficult questions of program evaluation, it really helps to have some frameworks at hand to be able to make sense of some of that. Not only for our own professional lives, but I think in a world in which we're increasingly moving, which is one in where evaluation more generally is being asked and expected of all different size groups, from the World Bank to small NGOs, the private sector as well, and a lot of crazy stuff happens in that evaluation space. Lots of claims are made about the wonders or the evils of particular interventions, and I think as development professionals we need to be able to have at our disposal some not experience in the first instance, I guess, but also some tools and sensibilities, or some skills and sensibilities for thinking about how to interpret a lot of that kind of back and forth. So that's what I'm going to do. I work full-time in the research department of the World Bank. That's my regular job. But I also teach part-time at the Kennedy School, and have a wonderfully rich spring semester every year with a group of, this year, about 70 students or so, where wrestling with these kinds of issues is something we're very much at the center of what we try to get our heads around. So I'm going to present some of that to you today, and probably take about 50 minutes or so to lay that out, and then hopefully we'll have some extended time at the end for Q&A, because there's no shortage of issues to talk about in this space. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a sense of the background of where I'm coming from with all of this stuff. Then I'm going to have just a brief little riff on the art, the science, and the politics of evaluation, just so that we can situate what we're talking about today in a broader landscape. Then I'm going to talk about construct internal and external validity, the canonical ways in which validity has been handed down to us. You may well have studied that even in undergraduate methodology classes. The famous Cook and Campbell distinctions, I think, are very relevant still today, but we have, I think, a range of other issues that present themselves now, for which using these things in creative ways rather than just sort of holding canonically to the original definitions is really central to how we adapt these for 21st century reality. So I'm going to try and do that as well. My particular focus is going to be on what I'm going to call complex interventions. Now that's it happens to be the case that that's mostly what I spend my life worrying about, but I should also be quick to add that there's no such thing really as a simple intervention. Anyone who works in development knows that just doing anything is really hard. But I'm going to have a particular definition of what I mean by complex interventions, which are the ones that the social development and the legal departments of the World Bank find themselves engaging in, and that's the parts of the World Bank that I work with most directly in terms of these kinds of issues. And then I'm going to have a particular focus on external validity. I think, as we'll see, construct validity is relatively well understood, even if it's not always only honoured in the breach oftentimes. Internal validity is where there's a huge amount of politicking going on right now, and I want to try and have something constructive to say about that. But the big sort of area that I think we're woefully inadequate on, we collectively, researchers in particular, but the broader group of development professionals, is these questions of external validity, or the generalizability of the claims that we make about interventions. So I want to sort of ask these pretty basic questions, really, about, well, if we have a squeaky clean impact result from people working over there on country X on intervention Y, under what conditions can we confidently presume that similar kinds of results will be adopted elsewhere? And I think we've been very cavalier in that kind of discussion. Researchers, at least elite researchers in particular, focus almost exclusively on these internal validity questions. That's what gets you published in fancy journals, and that's sets very powerful incentives for those kind of researchers to double down on those kind of questions. But I think as practitioners, we're concerned, yes, about internal validity questions, but we're equally, if not more, concerned about the generalizability of things across scale, across groups, across contexts, and across implementation modalities. And once you're in that space, then I think a lot of the standard tools that we're taught, indeed many of the standard tools that my Kennedy School students are taught actually don't turn out to be that useful. So there's a lot of space for thinking creatively around these external validity questions, but that's where I want to sort of center much of my remarks today. My sort of general takeaway point is that we really need to expand the range of ideas, methods, and strategies for doing all these aspects of negotiating with validity questions. That's where, at least in certain corners of the universe, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in danger of setting up very powerful monopolies on what counts as questions and what counts as answers. And I think that the kinds of questions that the 21st century is throwing at us, the kinds of challenges we're being asked to address, require the full range of human knowledge, and those reside partly in economics, they reside partly in other social sciences as well. If I'm sounding a little defensive right off the get-go, that's in part because I'm the only sociologist in the research department of the World Bank. There's 99 economists and me. So I've spent the last 15 years of my life trying to wage a lone battle for trying to break some of that disciplinary monopoly by arguing on their own terms, right? The economists are supposed to believe in comparative advantage. They're supposed to believe in the virtues of the evils of monopolies. And my argument basically is that we should defer to comparative advantage. There are lots of questions for which particular disciplines have a distinct comparative advantage, particularly with regards to questions of context, as we'll see shortly. But I also believe in the open exchange of ideas and evidence as much as I believe in the open exchange of goods and services. And for the kinds of conversations I hope we can have towards the end of this session, it's very much about trying to figure out how to tap into the full array of human knowledge to be able to tap the full array of human questions that we're being asked to address in development these days. Okay, so this is my one. I'll be referring to several books along the way. This one you may or may not have seen. It just came out last year by a philosopher and a practitioner, Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy, respectively. And the whole book basically is fairly abstract, but at least one of the first books to really seriously engage with these questions of external validity. And I like this opening quote because I think it summarizes a lot of my general position on these things. The bulk of the literature presently recommended for policy decisions cannot be used to identify what works here. And this is not because it may fail to deliver in some particular cases, and it's not because its advice fails to deliver what it can be expected to deliver. The failing is rather that it is not designed to deliver the bulk of the key facts required to conclude that it will work here. Maybe you have to read that a couple of times. That's actually a wonderful statement saying, look, these great tools that we're promoting at the moment, they're fantastic for answering a particularly narrow class of questions, a particularly narrow subset of the problems, but they were not set up to answer the very real questions that we now find ourselves being asked, which is these generalizability questions. If we have a pilot project, for example, will it work if we make it 10 times bigger? Right? An RCT doesn't, the randomized control trial type work doesn't answer that question. If we get a great result in Mali, will it work in Argentina? I don't know. We don't know that. We don't have a good set of tools for answering those kind of questions. If it works with one particular demographic group within a given country, will it work for another demographic group? If it worked in the highlands, will it work in the cities? Will it work in rural areas? These are all very fundamentally questions of external validity, and most of what we are doing, I think, in research at the moment, embodied in books like Poor Economics, is very much making one particular problem, the selection problem, as we'll see shortly, the question around which these big questions about impact turn. And they do in part turn on selection questions, but as we'll see once we start to get into more complex types of interventions, which I'm presuming is probably most of what the people in this room spend your lives worrying about, then these particular tools, it's not they don't become wrong, they're just only able to address a very limited, delimited space of what we actually need to know. And as we move into, as I said, these worlds where we're wanting to scale up, where we're wanting to make very hard decisions, where careers and lives and reputations are on the line, then we need to have our wits about ourselves when we're engaging with these questions of external validity. That's what I want to get us to today. 30 seconds of shameless self-promotion. The big volume that I wrote 2 years ago with two of my colleagues on was on assessing this huge big project in Indonesia, which was a project designed in the aftermath of the fall of the New Order regime in the late 90s and rolled out, still being rolled out now actually, under a different name than the one that we assessed it as, but it's a huge big big projects to try and, on the one hand, consolidate local democracy, but also to try and in a more prosaic space, trying to provide resources and opportunities to poor villagers. But trying to get our heads around this, how to make sense around particularly around these questions about what impact it was having on embedding and consolidating local democracy was the big challenge given to me. And even if you don't know much about Indonesia or care about Indonesia, for the present moment, the methodological appendix of that book, which is about 40 pages long, pretty much shows the full array of social scientific methods that we threw at this particular project to try and make some defensible claims about whether it was working. And it was that was the mothership, as it were, that spawned a whole range of other interests and engagements in my life. But in a very pragmatic sense, around this external validity space, having spent literally 6 or 7 years wrestling with this project, trying to come up with defensible statements about whether it was working or not, and being correctly subject to numerous seminars where people were pushing back against various different claims we were making, which is fine. That's all the normal way in which science advances. But I would then find myself being sort of wheeled into meetings literally around Iraq and Afghanistan, where people would say, "Nice project you've got there in Indonesia, Michael. Should we try it in Afghanistan? Should we try it in Iraq?" How did we get to a world in which we would just be so cavalier about how about this transferability of things? So this is a very Indonesian project responding to an Indonesian problem, and designed, as it happens, on the basis of many years of work in the field before the end of the New Order regime, which have a much better handle on the idiosyncrasies of village life in Indonesia. But the notion then that once we've kind of nailed that, and we've got a project appraisal document that sort of is the project, and this project delivers this thing called results, now we want to get more results, so we'll now take it to other countries and contexts, just seems to me a very easy step to take, but a very erroneous one to make, or at least one that we need to have a far more circumspection about ourselves when it comes to being able to respond to that. So that's sort of part of what I'll talk about today comes from this. At the end of the presentation there's a list of various different other things I've written that you might find useful, and of course this presentation itself will be available to you if you so choose. Okay, so just let me start by having a few just things about sort of the art, the science and the politics of evaluation. I think when we're talking about the art of evaluation, we're really talking about the sensibility one needs to be able to engage in these things, which is distinct from, I think, the science, as it were, which is about skills and theory, which is what tools do we use and how do we package those together and how do we make sense of what we're doing. But the art of evaluation is very much about having particular sensibility about what the nature of the problem is that we are addressing and what the particular context within which we are working. And I think also, a crucial part of that is also recognizing that so much of what we're doing is optimizing under highly, many and very numerous constraints. We're working with imperfect data and imperfect context with hugely inadequate budgets under ridiculous time horizons that we're expected to work. But that's how we make a living, right? That's what we've got to do. And so that's partly a technical exercise, but figuring out how to be useful when you're flown in for a weekend to do an evaluation, or when you're 6 months out from a major election and you know full well that the verdict of whatever you come up with is going to be used for or against, or be very much part of that political dialogue. All of those things, I think, are very much part of what we need to cultivate around a sensibility of evaluation about what we're getting into. I think part of the science, though, is also recognizing that within this broader social scientific space that I'm going to lay out shortly, we need to recognize that there are various different modes of causal reasoning. And now that's, when I say things like that amongst economists, that's sort of, it's like, I don't know, Hinduism amongst Orthodox Catholics. It's sort of trying to recognize that there are these vastly different ways of engaging with the world that are just so out of their cosmological order that it just bounces straight out. But I think if you have a good grounding in the history and philosophy of social science, you'll recognize that there are different serious modes of making causal claims about the world. One of those is statistical, and that's the dominant way in which public policy is conducted, oftentimes for exactly the right kind of reasons. But that's not the only way we can do that. Logic itself, if you do Sudoku puzzles on the metro to work every morning, you're engaging in a very particular kind of mental process of causal reasoning, and it's logic. It's not a probabilistic modality which statistics engage in. And if you're a fan of any of the sort of most famous TV shows over the last couple of decades, Law and Order and all the rest of it, you're seeing a very different kind of causal reasoning being made around cases, around standards of evidence that are being presented that have to meet certain criteria in order for consequences in the world to happen. And being aware of these very different modes of causal reasoning, I think, is important to be able to provide pushback against people that want to shoehorn you into one particular mode of causal reasoning and say, well, if you haven't satisfied that, then you're just providing anecdotes or you're a glorified poet. And I think that's just wrong. So anyway, that's sort of the art and the science, but ultimately, as I sort of indicated just before, we can't ever forget that we're involved in a very political exercise. We're engaged in evaluation, not just because of the lives that we're and careers that we're making judgment calls around, but because a lot of this stuff is deeply political. You're making very big claims on that affect their reputations and the careers of very powerful people. And you haven't lived in the world of evaluation until you've had to tell the mayor of a city that his flagship program actually doesn't work. Those are very, very difficult things, and that pressure that can be exerted on you to do this, to tell them what they want to hear, is very, very hard. One of our sort of jokes we have in the research department is that we periodically get these calls from operational staff saying, we'd really like you to work with our program and so we can help us to prove that it works. Right? Well, in a strict sense, that's not what researchers do. We don't prove that things work. We test whether they work, and if it works, great, but maybe it isn't. And so even, or especially perhaps people that have invested years of their lives, their whole careers around one thing that they really deeply believe in emotionally as well as pragmatically, once it's part of a deep part of people's identities, and you're subjecting those kinds of aspects of people's lives to these nerdy sounding things like evaluation. It's a very difficult step to be involved in. So what I'm going to do is sort of bounce, I guess, between sort of the art and the science part, but I just want you to know that I'm fully conscious of the politics part of it. You don't survive as the lone sociologist in a research department of the bank without having some very visceral sense of how the politics of ideas plays itself out. And as we now find ourselves engaging with these very big imperatives to meet Millennium Development Goals and to be able to provide evidence base for what we're doing, etc., etc., I think it's very important that we ground ourselves not just in the pragmatics of tools to survive tomorrow, but that we have a map for making sense of that landscape that we're entering. And I want to try and give you some sense of that right now. Okay, so as I mentioned, in this canonical delineation set up by a methodologist, Cook and Campbell, many years ago, they distinguish between three different types of validity, and I'm going to add a fourth, or at least a pretty crucial component of the second one, which I think is underappreciated. When we talk about construct validity, which is the first of these things, we're basically asking, do the key concepts that different askers and responders and interpreters of data are using, do they mean the same things to the same people? What gets lost in translation? So if you've ever asked a survey, for example, if you've ever had to translate a survey from one language to another, you know that there are some pretty basic terms that just kind of just don't quite work when you try and translate them, right? And there are particular concepts that we use routinely in development speak that are oftentimes very different to how other people interpret that. And I'll have a bit more to say about that, but I don't want to get too lost in that, because I think, generally speaking, people kind of understand that. The more vexing methodological tasks center around these questions of internal validity, which is the cause and effect kind of relationship. So do in fact better scores lead to smarter children, or to class sizes, or teacher salaries, all these things which we try and test out in development. And have we considered other things that might be simultaneously occurring that might be driving those kind of results? And those are called, as we'll see, confounding variables, other things other than the intervention which might be going on, including selection effects. So Most of the, as we'll see, most of the sort of center of gravity around worrying about internal validity questions is about trying to separate out Nate Silver's famous book, most recently, The Noise and the Signal, right? Trying to sort of say, what's the signal, what's actually going on, and what's just other stuff that we need to filter out in some in methodological sense in order to be able to discern what constitutes the actual signal. Now, one thing that I think most people worrying about internal validity have not worried about is this question of a theory of change, or what the intervention's impact should look like over time. What trajectory of change should we expect to see, and how can we try and have what I'll call much stronger sense of the reasoned expectations, which is to say, in its simplest form, where you expect to be by when. Right? So when you cut a ribbon on a bridge, for example, it's pretty likely that the impacts that you will see are going to be fairly immediate, because now the traffic can flow in both directions, trade and commerce and all the rest of it can expand. But if your life is spent being worried about empowering rural women in Afghanistan, for example, how long have you got to toil away at that before you actually see something that's measurable that will produce an impact that you can go back to Washington and present to your bosses and say, see, my work is working, I'm doing this great stuff, see? And the different kinds of trajectories that we are on with the various different interventions, as we'll see more graphically shortly, I think is something that we as researchers have vastly underappreciated, because I think the how we get from here to there really matters, and that line, despite most of our presumptions, is often very non-linear. And then the last one is, of course, is this external validity, or how generalizable are the claims. If it works here, will it work there? If it works with this group, with that group, is bigger better? Those are all the questions of external validity, and those are the ones I want to focus on. So let's start with construct validity. I do a lot of work, for example, at the moment around questions of justice, local justice reform, right? Now, you might think, oh, yeah, justice. Justice is kind of a bit of a weird word in English. Development is especially a weird word in English. And what other people hear when you use those words is actually not always something that can be captured adequately in survey instruments. When we work in a tiny Pacific Island country called Vanuatu, for example, right? The Ni Vanuatu people literally have no word for poverty in their language. It's not inconceivable to people that they would be poor as we understand that in a material deprivation sense. Right? That word does not exist in their language. So you can't really kind of do a poverty survey in that country because the very elementary aspects of the different dimensions of that are just not understood in their language. Right? They understand exclusion. They understand that people can be kicked out for various different reasons, or shunned, or left out. So we can talk about inclusion and exclusion. That's fine. We can kind of get at that. But these questions of poverty, no, they just don't. That concept doesn't resonate in their world. Right? So once we're dealing with other things like violence or ethnicity, all these other words that are actually part and parcel of everyday development discourse, when you try and actually formalize that into a survey instrument to try and say, is this particular variable going up or down as a result of my particular intervention? Construct validity is all a very nerdy kind of discussion around whether what I'm saying and what you're hearing and what other people are interpreting are actually more or less the same, right? And you have a construct validity problem to the extent that those are actually out of sync with one another, right? So cutting and pasting survey tools off the web is one prime way in which construct validity concerns start to get really out of control, because it takes a long time to get a survey instrument right? You think, well, these guys in Sri Lanka have kind of worked on this, we'll just sort of assume that they've kind of got the bugs out of their system, and then we'll just take it and sort of make the adaptations we need, and it'll work. Well, maybe it will, but there's big, serious questions around of construct validity when we're trying to figure out whether we can in fact take concepts and words and phrasings of questions from one context to another. And it also matters then for when we're trying to make global comparisons. Now we in the research department of the World Bank encounter this all the time. Most of my immediate colleagues around me spend their lives conducting these big surveys in countries to try and make judgment calls about whether poverty is going up or down in the world. So when we're discussing what effect did the recent global financial crisis have on poverty in the world, and you hear reported in the Washington Post that the World Bank says that 285 million people were put into poverty, that factoid kind of number comes out of the other very serious group of microeconomists that spend their lives trying to worry about how we design instruments for poverty analysis in the 120 odd countries in which we do this kind of work. But comparing poverty means very different things. How you measure poverty, and whether you measure it by consumption or expenditure, or earnings or salaries. I mean, all these different things can mean very different things once they actually start to be compared. So even something that you would think the world would have a relatively good handle on the World Bank would have a good handle on after 50 years of wrestling with this, even that really elementary concept doesn't mean the same thing when all 120 of our countries' representatives span out across their country every 5 years or so to take the pulse of poverty in their country. Right? So these are big questions. But as I said, if you're having this conversation on my floor of the World Bank is entirely normal and natural. Everybody groans because they know only too well. That's a big issue that they have to have endless rounds of negotiating and missions with representatives from the Census Office or the Statistical Agency, the National Ministries of Planning, to figure all that out. Right? So that's all I'm going to say about it, because it's a big issue, but it's kind of well understood, and I think the intuition behind that is well understood for everyone in this room. I assume that sort of worked in multiple different countries and tried to figure out how notions of empowerment, for example, translate across different linguistic groups or different gender groups. All that stuff is just quintessentially a construct validity problem when you're trying to formalize that into some sort of survey instrument or even a qualitative tool. As it happens, we have some recent innovations that have been put forward to try and get around these kind of questions. A famous methodologist at Harvard called Gary King has come up with this nice notion of anchoring vignettes that he has used, which are just little stories that they insert within the body of household surveys to try and get a better handle on this. This came about because they were trying to look at perceptions of the quality of government in a cross-national sense, and it turned out that they were getting very low scores in China on the quality of government, and very high scores on the quality of government and very low scores on the quality of government in Mexico. They're going, how would that, when the quality of everyday services in Mexico City, or at least anywhere, is transparently better? Why is it when people are asked these questions about these perceptions of government that they get these very different answers, right? Which is just so clearly out of whack with order. And so what they did was just insert a qualifying little vignette underneath each of these questions, which was basically to say, if there was a pothole in your street, how long do you think it would take for the Department of Public Works to show up to fix it, right? That was their little vignette, right? And then they would use that then to say, okay, now, and then use the answers to that as the basis for getting better measures of government performance. So there's a literature on that which you can type into Scholar Google and read your heart out on these people that have tried to come up with, in the orthodox quantitative household survey sense, a recognition of this construct validity problem is real, but we're not helpless in that space. So there are ways that we can come up with to try and get some better alignments between what we are saying, what they are hearing, and then what we collectively interpret. Okay, so now it gets more interesting, because that's kind of everyone understands that, I think. I see lots of nodding heads. Yeah, we kind of get construct validity. The much more harder question to get at, this is what 99% of the energy on our Wednesday lunchtime seminars is all spent around is beating each other up over this thing called internal validity. Right? Now, when we think about this in the standard way, if you're reading an introductory book around impact evaluation or taking a course on this through the World Bank Institute, there'll be something that basically that says, well, the impact that you are observing is a function of the design of this intervention, this particular project, whatever it is that you've come up with, whatever it is you're working on, and that the impact of that design is conditional on. That's what that vertical line means. Conditional on sort of the selection effects about how truly random you've been able to, how well you've been able to allocate this to a particular group, but also then find a comparable non-program group to try and get a good match between those two things. And randomizing is the sort of the high standard way of doing that, but there are various different other matching techniques one can come up with for trying to get an appropriate match between your treatment group and the group that did not receive that. So that's well understood. And then even within these selection effects, then you have to worry about other stuff like the level of education, for example, or the proximity to markets, or the levels of employment. Right? Now those are things, again, that good standard statistical instruments are very comfortable with. Everybody understands all of that, and we can do that kind of work fairly well. So if you're looking at shifts in prices, or whether even when you're looking at No Child Left Behind or anything else, the way in which we tend to think about this is, certainly by the time we're back into the political claim-making space and we're saying No Child Left Behind doesn't work, or the stimulus worked, or that this particular textbook works, or it's better to have a smaller class size, or contract teachers are more effective than government teachers. All these kind of claims that are being made, ultimately in this space, for present purposes, are about trying to see that the causal agent doing the impacting is this thing called the project, right? The little box around it that we'll just, for the moment, call the project. And certainly in the World Bank, and I imagine in your organization as well, that's sort of how the dominant tone of conversation is. When you talk about what you do or what project you're working on and whether it's working or not, right? Most of that tends to be at this sort of big aggregate level. I'm working on this big community-driven development program in Indonesia, and it's going great, right? What does that mean? Well, you think, well, intuitively, you're saying this project is the causal agent. It's doing all this wonderful stuff called development. And yes, in my head, I recognize that it's sort of I have to worry about some other things that might be going on in the world simultaneously to sort of get rid of this noise, to focus on the signal. But yes, somehow, either experientially or with some relatively well set up evaluation protocol, I can make defensible claims about what that is. Now that's fine for the 101 level, for the most part, right? And a lot of what we end up doing, I think, is unfortunately is focusing on development interventions that happen to be reducible to that kind of logic, because that's how you can make defensible claims about things. But I think that sort of model is inadequate for thinking about very complex interventions. And what do I mean by a complex intervention? As we'll see shortly, I think it's where you have a design that has lots of multiple. It's very multifaceted. It has lots of moving parts to it, right? So, like the canonical example would be something like the most extreme complex stuff are things like social work, for example, where you're trying to engage with a family and you're trying to make very difficult decisions about whether this family, for example, is sufficiently dysfunctional that you now remove the children from this family and make them wards of the state, right? Wrenchingly difficult to do that kind of work. And I have a mother and a sister who are social workers. I grew up with this. These are very difficult decisions that aren't just sort of, there's no dashboard of indicators that you can use to sort of move the needle one way or another. It's a deeply, it's an experientially based, professionally based decision, but it's a different professional in that same space could well make a slightly different kind of decision. But I think a lot of what we're doing in development, where it's around even the space of agricultural extension, where you're trying to get farmers to adopt new fertilizer behavior, or you're working on HIV prevention campaigns amongst high-risk adolescents in urban parts of Africa, right? That you're really fundamentally trying to change people's behavior, not just test out whether a new drug or a new kind of fertilizer, for example, is working or not, right? Most of the stuff that we're doing, that we find ourselves wrestling with now around making, or trying to figure out how to consolidate democracy in the Middle East, or how to be able to consolidate a peace process in a post-conflict country, right? Nobody knows how to do that kind of stuff, right? But we want to believe that we do, and we want to be able, and we can make yourself a superstar if you can claim that you found this intervention that works, that can do that. And I think there are things that we can show that work, but I think there's a lot of stuff we're doing in development where the presumption that we know ex ante what to do, even when we perhaps have a good track record of something in other countries, is itself part of the problem, not part of the solution. Coupled with that, because these things are often multifaceted, they have a very deep engagement with the context within which they're working. By design, they're really trying to be literally context specific. They're trying to map onto the contextual realities of the circumstance in which they're finding themselves. We know, for example, that we can eradicate polio. We have, for the most part, we, the world community, have done a pretty good job of ending the scourge of a disease that was the bane of human existence for many thousands, tens of thousands of years, right? But that's because the science of that was figured out pretty quickly, and then the implementation of it was able to be done by a logistics machine. Essentially, could fan out across the country and inject babies. And if you can do that tens of thousands or millions of times, you can actually do some pretty amazing things in the world. But a lot of the problems, most of the problems we are dealing with in the world now don't have a sort of a biochemical type solution, and aren't amenable then to just an array of faithful functionaries doing identically the same behaviours and actions in order to be able to implement it. Implementing a lot of these things around local justice reform, around women's empowerment, all these things just take deep amounts of not only engagement with context, but also a very big focus on implementation. And that's one of the other takeaways I hope from today, is that we try to ramp up our focus and our concern with these questions of implementation, because so much of the energy, much of the prestige in development seems to me goes to those people that can claim to either have designed something that works or to have proven that something that works. If you look at the Innovations for Poverty Action, the very influential group up at Yale, for example, on their website, is sort of a list of a whole bunch of things that have been proved, like literally with a stamp of gold thing. We, the research community, have hereby verified that this particular intervention works. All right? Okay, so should I take that to South Sudan? Is this new thing that you've just discovered or that you've verified that works in this design space, right? Is this truly something that we can now stick on a plane, hail you as the new development expert on this particular topic, and get you to do this, right? Maybe. I think the default assumption should be no. The default assumption should be, for a lot of these things, that we just don't know actually how to do these. We can learn certainly from the ideas and the experiences of other people, but simply cutting and pasting the design or believing or imputing the impacts to be a function of this thing called the design, this thing called the project, when so much of these interventions in general, and especially these highly complex interventions, are so crucially dependent on the quality of implementation that unless you've got that quality of implementation available to you, then the interaction effect is so strong that you just simply can't reasonably impute that you will get that same impact. And the last one that I'm going to extend a bit of time now talking about are these questions around the trajectories of change. One of the very defining features of highly complex interventions is they don't get from here to there in a straight line. They go, as we'll see, along many different paths, and where you happen to conduct your evaluation along those different paths can have vastly different consequences for the kinds of claims that you make then about the efficacy of what it is that you're doing. Okay, so I've pretty much talked about the consequences of all this is that it's very, very hard then to truly isolate in an internal validity sense the impacts of these highly complex interventions. It's very hard to make claims about whether they'll work anywhere else, but what we do need to worry not just about whether these things work, is about how they work. Right? And here I believe you've already, concluding slide, if I didn't inaccurately read it through the doors before I came. You're quoting people like Patricia Rogers and my fellow Australian and Ray Pawson and other people that are working on realist evaluation strategies, which are much more centered on the getting at the inside the black box in the literal sense, really trying to understand the mechanisms, the how questions rather than the whether questions about these particular projects. And I think for these very complex interventions, having an array of different tools at your disposal for being able to explain how and for whom particular interventions are working, rather than just in the aggregate, is this thing working, is a really crucial component. Hopefully that'll become, the reality of that and the implications of that will be clearer as we forge on. So rather than just focusing on these things, the design quality, which is all the red stuff at the top there, that was sort of carry over from the previous slide. The design quality, the selection effects, and the confounding variables, those three things in the top. Well, I think there are three other things that we need to worry about once we're trying to make claims in the internal validity space and the external validity space around complex interventions. What I want to do now, I'm going to talk about this thing called causal density, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. I'm going to talk about implementation and context sort of together. We can refer to those in the language that Nancy Cartwright does as support factors, and then this reasoned expectations. So that might look a little complicated. Basically what it's saying is you can have, there's certainly design quality matters, this first thing called DQ. You can have a lousy project. There is such a thing as crappy design that just won't work, right? And we need to recognize that. But design can not just be in a technical sense be strong or weak. It can be very much functioning around in this causal density space, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly, but it's essentially the more homely analogy I used before around just how many moving parts are there in your system. And once you have a system that's not controllable, but in a mechanical sense, which most development projects probably aren't, then you have a very strong interaction effect then between sort of the quality of the design, but then also the vast number of different component elements to your implementation that that really determine the nature of what you're trying to do. Then you have these support factors. Together, those two things need to be then worried about, not just in terms of the standard concerns around selection and confounding variables, but we need to worry about this in terms of the reasoned expectations about where this will, where we should be by when. Right? So that might look a little formal, but I hope that the intuition behind it becomes clear as we start to move forward. What I'm going to start off is working with this reasoned expectations, because this is an issue for internal validity concerns as much as it is a concern for external validity concerns, this one down here. All right, so here's our standard way in which we tend to think about evaluation, right? We have a time t0, which is the baseline, right? We start off, hopefully we collect some data on the state of the world as we now encounter it, and we have this net impact, not just impact, the net impact. We're controlling for all the things we need to control for. We've got a treatment group and some sort of comparison group of some kind. And then at some point down the track, whether it be 6 months or 6 years or whatever, we take another measure. And usually what we just simply do is connect those, the data from one point and subtract it from the data at the second point, and we just assume that we got from here to there along this thing called a straight line. And literally that slide more or less is taken from World Bank Institute training seminar slide. Right? This is how we tend to think about these things. Right? We have baseline, we have follow-up, we just subtract those two things out, controlling for all those other things we need to control for, and then we make some claim about whether this intervention has worked or not. Right? So I hope this simple addition shows you how you got from 0 to 1, or how you got from here to there, really matters, right? Because if we end up with, in the time t1, and we've taken these 4 different routes, but we don't know which particular route we've taken, we would blissfully ignorantly, all these 4 different paths would all make the same claim about the impact that they have had, because they're identical, right? With the final end over there, right? But let's just say you didn't, when you've been evaluated at this second point in time is kind of arbitrary, right? Unless there's some deep science that says you really know exactly that we should be testing this out by a particular time. Most of the time it's a political cycle, or it's you're on mission, or you're on a posting for a certain number of years or months or whatever, and so we just do the evaluation largely around convenience. But if we took this same project and then recognized that it could potentially, or did actually, follow 4 different paths, we would tell 3 very different stories. If we evaluated not just at time t1 at point C, if we evaluated at point time C, everybody would be saying, yeah, our project's great. The net impact of what we're doing is positive. Right? But let's say you're at a different point in the cycle. You're at point B, right? Well, these poor guys down here on the blue line and the green line have no impact, unfortunately. They can't show anything. And these guys up here are making all sorts of wonderful statements about how fantastic their particular intervention is. Right? And if you're unlucky enough to actually be evaluated at point A, right, you tell 4 very different stories. Right? These guys are doing fine. These guys are doing all right. These guys are flatlining and not having any impact, but geez, you don't want to be on the J-curve, right? The J-curve impact was where things get worse before they get better, and if some pointy-headed researcher shows up when you happen to be at the bottom of your J-curve, not only have you not had any impact, you've made things worse, and you're now going to be hauled before some disciplinary body to explain why your actions are in fact counterproductive, right? I would suggest that a lot of the stuff that we're doing in the governance space and in the empowerment space are on that green or that blue line. Right? Most of what we know about political history, about history of revolutions, about transitions to democracy around the world, they never happened in sort of some nice little iteration along a straight line from here to there. They happen seismically. They literally happen like earthquakes. They have lots of nothingness, and then there's a poof, there's a big rupture. Right? As it happens in evolutionary biology, Stephen Jay Gould and other people have made pretty much that same kind of trajectory. It's called a punctuated equilibrium. In development speak, it means you have to toil away in obscurity for long periods of time, probably seeing no fruit whatsoever for what you're trying to do, and then maybe some great moment happens when you're vindicated, and suddenly all of the work that you're doing has come to pass. Right? Now, I think if you look, for example, very in our own lifetime, literally over the last 3 years, about gay marriage, for example, right? We are literally seeing seismic transformation within the last 3 years around the United States, at least, with regards to legal and attitudinal responses to questions of gay marriage, right? if you were a gay marriage advocate in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you probably spent 30 or more years of your entire life campaigning in utter obscurity for that kind of change to occur, right? I think any student of social movements, any student of social history would say, we're only seeing this big uptick now because of all the work that was done in obscurity and in the past, right? If you're a student of and at least probably 60% of this room, I imagine, is a student of women's suffrage, right? Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1780, right? How long did it take from that launch of the women's movement to get the vote? Another 120 years. How long did it take for them to get, we're still not into a world of equal pay, right? So there's lots of ways in which the stuff we really care about, right? Ending slavery, the civil rights, I mean, all these things that are so fundamental to human welfare never just got there on some nice little neat line that we could monitor our progress and make big claims to our funders about what we were doing. The really, really hard stuff, the stuff that people who are going to hate you for what you're trying to do, who are going to try and launch a vicious counter-assault on the claims that you are trying to make around immigration, around anything else, right? That's one of the politics of this stuff. Because a lot of what you're trying to do just isn't sort of some nice little technical fix to try and make things get a little closer to where we want to be. A lot of the really, really hard stuff is, I think, is on J-curve kinds of trajectories, around really trying to recognize that when you push back against some forms of injustice, the first thing that's probably going to happen to you is you're going to get the crap beaten out of you, right? And you're going to probably make the situation worse, probably, just because you're going to upset a lot of people, you're going to find your leading staff potentially in jail. That's the kind of stuff you sign up for when you engage in human rights reform in Guatemala, for example, right? Some of my most moving interviews have been spat with people doing that kind of work, and just makes my life just seem like a complete piece of fairy floss compared to what they have to do each day for a living, and how they make sense of what they're doing, and how they claim that what they're doing is working or not. Right? So when their comrades are getting shot and assassinated on the side of the road, have they failed? Or is that just the price you've got to pay in order to be able to move these very fundamentally entrenched forms of political inequality? Right? So these questions around reasoned expectations aren't just abstractions. They're any student of history, I think any student of attempts to try and make the world a better place, which development fundamentally is, need to recognize that it's, we all want to be on the nice little dotted curve. We all want to be stars that can proclaim great, immediate, spectacular, visible, photographable impacts to justify our existence and to get promoted and all those nice kinds of things. But I think a lot of the reality of doing work in development, and a lot of the people whose names are represented on the board in the back corner of the room, are people that signed up for something that was way more dangerous than nice little technocratic fixes. They signed up to try and make the world a better place, knowing potentially full well that it could cost them their life for doing so. Right, so that's the dramatic version. Right? But a lot of, when you're trying to reform schools, right? When you're trying to take on a teachers union, or you're trying to implement microcredit programs, and you're trying to entrench a local mafia that's got a control of the credit system. And all those things just are very, you're challenging very powerful interests. And to imagine that we can just sort of set up some nice technical thing that can sort of get with 2 decimal point degrees of accuracy what the impact of this particular intervention is necessary in some sense, but I think it really helps to recognize that there's a much bigger space around which these things can occur. And most of the evaluations that I've seen, even done by the people who are the most famous and win all sorts of nice awards for it, do not at all think about the kinds of time scales and trajectories that they're working on in that space. Now, in other fields, it's routine to think like this. Right? If you're a horticulturalist and you're trying to test out your effectiveness as a gardener or as a grower of plants, and I give you randomly a bunch of seeds and you faithfully stick them in the ground and water them and make sure they have adequate sunlight and stuff, but it turns out that one of the seeds was an acorn and one of them was a sunflower seed, right? You know full well that after 6 weeks you're probably going to have this nice bright shining yellow thing, orange thing that you can photograph, and it'll be taller than you are and you'll feel very pleased with yourself. What have you got with your acorn? Literally nothing. It takes 6 months for the thing to even come out of its little shell in the ground. Right? But if you only relentlessly go on impact what's measurable by way of impact, then I declare you as a failure, even though 200 years later the oak tree is probably still going to be there, and their sunflowers are into their 200th generation later. right? Which is to say, data has to have a theory. Data has to be mapped onto, or claims about impact need to be made in the context of a theory of change. We have that in the plant world. I've never seen anybody make a claim around their impact project that sort of said, was very clear up front about saying this is probably going to take 10 years or maybe even longer to actually really change this particular process, and I want you to hang with me over that 10-year period, and I'm going to come for my annual review, my staff appraisal in year 6, and I'm going to have nothing to show for it, and it's going to be just fine. Right? Or, from a management point of view, how do you actually push back against that and say, well, hold on, maybe what you're doing is just folly, maybe it's just ridiculous, the intervention you're doing is just completely lousy, and no one should be doing it, not even heroes like you. Right? That's the weird space we're in development. We don't have any good way of helping us to be able to distinguish between those different kinds of claims that are that we need to. And that's why theory matters, it's why data matters, but it's why a dialogue and a conversation around those is really fundamental. Okay, so the external validity problem is what happens when you extrapolate that into the future. Well, if you believe in a straight line world, well, D is very easy to compute. It's y equals mx plus c. It's like grade 9 algebra. You can figure out what that's going to be, right? But if you're on these very different kinds of trajectories, could be all over the place. As it happens, I'm doing a write-up right now of a perversely interesting case of what we call a sort of a shooting star project, a project that was deemed unambiguously spectacularly successful in this first year or so in Cambodia, and happened to be evaluated pretty much unbeknownst to us at the time around about here. And literally the people that were managing that project were hailed as heroes, brought before the board of the bank for their moment of glory to be hailed as all-conquering heroes around this particular project, except 6 months later the entire country portfolio was in the toilet. Not a penny was being lent because that same project turned out to be so controversial, so divisive, and so hard to actually implement when it got hard, as opposed to when it was easy, that it literally brought the whole World Bank portfolio down in that country. Right? But they were literally up to this point here, and were very confidently assuming that everything was just going to go up there, right? And I think a different kind of social scientific sensibility would say maybe, but maybe not. Kind of stuff you're dealing with could in fact be so politically toxic that it could in fact come unglued. Right? Yeah, those are the kinds of questions I think we need to have a much richer sensibility about. I mean, to think like that about these kind of interventions, and then figure out the kind of tools and techniques we might need to get at that. Okay, let me just quickly go. That's a lot of words, but there's this external validity issue, which I've indicated is being very inadequately addressed at present, it seems to me. But it turns out that in other realms of science, a lot of people are doing some really interesting work on this stuff. Some of it makes its way into the New York Times, which you may have seen if you're a regular reader of the New York Times. There was a wonderful article a couple of months ago looking at work that had been done on some drug trials where they'd been literally studying the effects of various different pain medications on mice. Right? Now, the external validity question assumes that sort of mice physiology kind of is like mammalian physiology, and mammalian physiology is kind of what we are. So if we can test out the efficacy of these pain medications on mice, that's both ethically and efficiency-wise a good way to be able to figure out whether they're going to work on humans. And this, the money quote from this particular article was literally decades and billions of dollars have been wasted because it turns out that the particular physiology of the mice that they use to do all this pain medication research on isn't even representative of mice, let alone of mammalian species, let alone of humans. Right? So a whole enterprise of people who wear white lab coats for a living, whose whole external validity premise was built on this little creature called a black six is the name of this particular mouse. I think I've got his name up there somewhere. Yeah, black six. Read Daniel. Just type Daniel Engberger black six into Slate, which is where this award-winning article that he wrote on this even before this thing. There's a wonderful political economy and anthropology and history of the production of this little critter called black six, which is the DNA of which was known to literally to every aspect of this little creature was known well before we had the human genome sequence mapped out. This particular creature was, everything about it was understood, or so they thought, except it turned out the black six was a lazy bum and alcoholic mouse for whom we couldn't make any extrapolations and generalizabilities around. They only discovered this after the fact. Right? So even the people that literally wear white lab coats for a living are struggling with this question of external validity. Another great paper, which you probably haven't read, but you should, it's called The Weirdest People in the World. I imagine many of you as undergraduates participated in various forms of psychology experiments where you were asked to interpret obscure shapes on the wall, or you were asked to sort of subject yourself to hypnosis, or to engage with various different either offensive or racist images, and you had to sort of make judgments about all these things. Now, the whole discipline of psychology sort of rests on that data pool of the United States and European undergraduates as their pool for making what it turns out to be pretty big claims about humanity or what else. And so this wonderful, very influential paper called The Weirdest People in the World is all about how, in fact, these people are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. WEIRD is an acronym. It turns out that the weirdest, that white people going to colleges in North American European universities are highly unrepresentative of how the rest of the world responds to a lot of these similar kinds of stimuli and images and perceptions and all the rest of it. So again, in psychology, these questions of external validity, about whether you can take a narrow subset and make these big claims about humanity in this case, turns out to be not so valid either. So I won't go over the critiques in economics, but just these two examples from the fields in which people do actually wear white lab coats and worry deeply about the hard science, and in fields that would like to think they're scientific, like psychology, there's been a lot of deep sort of existential crises, almost literally within these fields, around these questions of around external validity. Not surprisingly, I haven't been sort of a reader of these nice, otherwise obscure, but it turns out wonderfully interesting pieces of work. What does that mean for people like us in development when we're trying to make these big claims about impact and projects that I think turn out we're running on some weird projects, or at least projects that are very, maybe on a good day, are fine for the country and the context and the people of which they're working, but the extent to which we can generalize from that to other times, other places, other people, other scales of operation, I think is much more suspect. So to get a better handle on that, I'm going to come to these other. This is this thing I had up there before, but now I'm going to talk about these questions of causal density and support factors, and I want to just use those to finish up with. When we're talking about causal density, we're basically the number of autonomously moving parts in the system. I'll step back a bit. So your proverbial Swiss watch, for example, has very low causal density. Even if it's got 1,000 pieces inside it, all those cogs, the beauty of them is that they are all interconnected with one another, such that if you move this little cog over here, that little cog moves over there, and we can, watchmakers over the last 300 or 400 years have figured this system out, such that we can now keep time to within tenths of a second over decades. Right? That's how accurate we are. We can now perfectly connect all of these different pieces in the puzzle. So that's a very low causal density kind of world. It might have lots of different moving parts. They're not autonomously moving parts. They're all beautifully interconnected. That's the genius of doing something like that. Right? On the other side, of course, we have modern family. And if your modern family is anything like my modern family, sort of what goes in and what comes out has all sorts of stuff that we have no idea really how to control. Right? Or if you're a parent in this room, you wake up every day with some causal model sort of in your head about what it's going to take to produce a minimally competent and functioning member of society. But what you do and what walks out of your house every day is kind of lots of weird stuff goes on there, right? And humans have literally been at this for tens of millions of years, and we still haven't figured it out. And our ancestors and our people that follow us for another 1,000 generations won't figure it out either, right? That's the space of what it means, both phenomenologically and empirically, to be in a world of trying to influence other human behavior. Even the things that we care most deeply about, even the things that people we've produced, literally, right? We still can't control that in a low causal density space. It's a high causal density space, because what you do over here and what happens over here has all sorts of other crazy stuff that even when you are the producer of that space, you don't understand it, right? And that's fine, right? A lot of stuff in religion, lots of stuff goes on in that same sort of space of stuff that we just don't understand. It's a very high causal density space. All sorts of stuff, known and unknown, is interacting in that. Right? So it makes it almost impossible to be able to make claims about the impact in high causal density spaces. And as well, my central claim here is that the higher the intervention's complexity, the higher its causal density, the lower its external validity. Right? So over the course of the last 30 years, if you look at the bestsellers on how to raise happy, functioning kids. I mean, what I grew up, at least with Benjamin Spock and all that was the received wisdom for that. Now it's someone else, and it's someone else that'll be another 10 years time, whatever. This is how it goes. There's no gradual approximation to the truth, and somewhere 3 generations down, they're going to have this eureka moment when they finally figure out the science of child rearing. We don't want it actually to work like that either. That'd be terrible if there was a mechanical relationship between you do this and something else comes out. And that's novelists and filmmakers over the centuries have warned us of a world in which we imagined that the desirable end state was a world in which everything was perfectly understood. Right? Crazy stuff happens in there. But that's the world we encounter. That's the world of trying to consolidate democracy. It's the world of trying to give women the vote. It's the area of trying to bring about more effective justice systems. I mean, all those are high causal density spaces. And to imagine that they're just variants on a Swiss watch, that if we get this little part of this little wheel right, or if we can isolate the effect of this little cog over here, that we can imagine that, yes, now this will have a big impact on the system. Right? And then that seems kind of crazy to me. There is a serious proposal one of my friends was telling me about the other day about justice reform in Sierra Leone. And because we've so got our obsessions about the mechanistic, low causal density world, they're now subjecting Supreme Court justices will have little pop-ups appearing on their screen, and they're going to be randomly able to allocate these little pop-ups to certain judges and not others, and now they're going to test out whether the judges that receive the message this way are going to respond this way. Right? Right? That's an incredibly small method to answer, provide us a very small answer to a very small question. It's just most of what I imagine inspires everyone in this room to get out of bed every day is this much bigger, visceral, complicated, messy, sometimes very nasty kinds of contests that we're trying to engage in. And we shouldn't abandon our methodological sensibilities for making claims about the impact of what we're doing. It's just that we need to, I think, have a much richer sense of what we do, the more causally dense the space we're working in. The less we're working in the world of biological implement, like polio that I mentioned before, or the impacts of fertilizers and seeds, all of which the science of that kind of is well understood. A lot of good people working on those kind of issues. But for the high causal density space around governance and law, around gender relations, around our attitudes to groups other than our own, however we define that, right? All those are occurring in this very highly causal density space. And we need a very different kind of set of tools for engaging in them and then making claims about whether and how those things are working. Now, as it happens, there's been a really nice study recently just trying to look at which is better, the randomized controlled trial kind of evidence, or what this particular group calls quality implementation collaboratives, which is the vernacular version of this would be make it up as you go along. Right? So I'm not sure whether in your world sort of this obsession with doing randomized controlled trials is a big deal, but if it isn't, you will encounter it soon enough if you have to get funding or seek funding from other people that say, well, what's the evidence for this? And have you subjected it to an RCT and all the other horrible things? But what these guys do, this is a simulation exercise, but they basically sort of say, let's treat the problem we're dealing with in terms of having a high or a low causal density kind of space. And one way in which you can graphically represent a complex space is to distinguish between the ruggedness of its landscape. Right? So the pyramids of Egypt and Gaza, for example, would be a very low causal density space. Right? Perfect. The pyramids are all. The mathematics of that are well understood. They've stood the test of time. Everyone knows exactly what the dimensions are. Right? They're all identical. Right? That's pretty much the same. But in nature, every mountain is different. You have a category called mountains, but actually every mountain is different. And yes, you can acquire skills as a mountain climber, such that having climbed a bunch of really difficult mountains over here, you may well be able to climb a bunch of difficult mountains over here. But what you're doing essentially is working most of the time in these very complex mountain climbing, Matterhorn here, right, is that you're actually trying to work as part of a team, and you're getting regular iterative feedback around how to actually navigate your way up this particular mountain space. Right? Yeah. The point of this wonderful study was basically to show that if you're in a low causal density space, if you're in a world that looks like the Gazan pyramids, yes, then the randomized control trials produce the kinds of knowledge that will get you up that top of that apex faster than anyone else. Right? But you've only got to take a few bricks out of the side of the pyramid, turn it in from a perfect, nice clean fitness space into a rugged one, right? And suddenly the effectiveness of these RCT kind of best practice solutions to this thing disappear completely, and all of the big gains come from those people that can iterate their way up, and they've done this through tens of thousands of different simulations, and which is one of those things that nerdy researchers read. But if I can be an effective mediator of all that stuff, basically what it's saying is that they're providing very rigorous evidence that once you're in this space where it's highly uncertain, highly idiosyncratic in a particular way, then these make it up as you go along strategies turn out to be a far more effective way of being able to engage it, which means that big searches for "we know this works" or "this is the way in which you should do things" in capital letters, right? Or the Institute for Poverty and Accident, this kind of things. We have now certified this works, it's proven. Or that you get, what's the name in the New York Times that writes up her column on on things that have been proven to work in development, right? So everyone's busting themselves to be included in that particular column because now we've become famous, we've proven that this stuff works, right? This particular result is basically showing that, well, it might be interesting for the one instance where that does work, but for most of us engaging with worlds that look much more like Matterhorns than like Gaza pyramids, having a much more collaborative approach to figuring out in real time how to do that and tapping into people's real experience about how you do this can be a really fundamentally better way, a more effective way of actually navigating your way up. Okay. Let me, we haven't got much time left. I'm not going to do this stuff. This is sort of the, you can flip through that if you like in your own way. I want to just talk a bit about implementation. I think that's the next big thing we need to try and do a much better job of. As it turns out, one of the most recent studies that's come out from the Center for Global Development, our colleagues across the way, Justin Sandifer and his colleagues in Kenya have just done this wonderful study looking at taking the results of a particular study on teachers in education, a result that has a twofold aspects to it. One that it was came out of a randomized control study in India. They then took it into Kenya, and then they got a particular result that was kind of consistent with what they would have expected from India. But then what they did was to look at the same intervention, which was whether contract teachers were better than regular government teachers at being able to improve the test scores of kids. Right? That's the intervention, pretty straightforward. But then what they did was to look at what happens when exactly the same intervention, like to the detail, exactly the same intervention is implemented in very different kind of settings. One was done through a control group, one was done through World Vision, and the other was done through the Ministry of Education. Right? So that was and they did all this randomly. So they're using an RCT to test an RCT, basically. Right? They're being able to sort of use this random allocation across different implementation modalities to see whether, in fact, this thing called the design, or the project, as I've called it, is actually the causal agent. And what do you find? You find that the NGO, the World Vision, did pretty well with this, and this was the kind of result that was the celebrated one that everyone was making a big deal out of. But when the Ministry of Education did exactly the same kind of intervention, if anything, it went a little bit negative. Right? So, the intervention, the design characteristics, we should have contract teachers be the implementers of education because we've proven with our white lab coats on that this is the way to improve teachers' test scores. Well, that's fine, but it's deeply conditional on the type of or quality of implementation. And if you give that to a group that even ostensibly should be able to do this, called the Ministry of Education, at least in this particular instance here, so they do statistically worse than even a control group just doing the same kind of thing. Right? So that's in certain circumstances. This is a game breaker because this is an instance of just using the same tool that's otherwise used to make all sorts of grand claims against itself. And so saying, let's follow the logic of this particular sequence of reasoning forward and say, well, if this stuff really is verifiably working independently of context, then we should be able to get these results independently of context. And not surprisingly, for most of us, we don't. But in certain worlds, this is potentially going to have existential shockwaves. It's really trying to show that these things are very, very different. What I wanted to be able to show now, to conclude, is really to say that a lot of what we associate with these highly complex, high causal density interventions is that they can have very different kinds of impacts over the life of the intervention. You saw that from the four different kinds of trajectories that I showed before. But even for subgroups within that, group A and group here, for example, on average have the same kind of impact, right? But it matters from a point of view of implementation that the group A and group B have very different net impacts at the end of the day, and they also have very different impacts from one another. So what we think is true about a lot of these interventions, these very complex interventions, is that they The formal sense is that they're highly heteroscedastic, which means the further out in time you go, the bigger the variation that becomes, right? So with these kind of interventions, even if the net, the average effect, the red line effect is still what it is, right? As the further out in time you go with these interventions, the bigger the variance, because that's what a high causal density thing does. It just becomes increasingly more and more varied over time, and when it interacts with this thing called context, it only does this even more. So we have this huge opportunity in one sense if we can take real-time monitoring issues more seriously than we do, rather than just the evaluation space seriously. Building in real-time feedback loops into our interventions as a really central way of being able to manage this thing called complexity, rather than doubling down on these periodic inventions where you baseline, follow-up, da-da-da, and then hanging on a knife edge for whether the thumb is up or down when the evaluators emerge from their little room to the Delphic-like to render a verdict on what it is you've done. I think if we know up front that a lot of these interventions are going to be highly variable across time and space, then that presents a huge learning opportunity. What we should be able to do is to be able to iterate and adapt so that we shrink that space, that negative space from down here, right? We should be able to learn and then arc that trajectory up into a much more positive kind of space. And you can't do that, I don't think, if you're just waiting for these periodic forms of feedback from these big mega evaluations that are conducted every year or even every 6 months or so. I think we need to do a much better job of working with our monitoring systems to be able to make these real-time adjustments to what we're doing so that we learn from what we're doing in real time. Now, there's a literature around this. Some of you may know the work on positive deviance that's come out in epidemiology and other places where very big attempts to try and always exploit standard deviations, not just means, right? Try to understand there's always variation. There's always people above and below whatever average effect it is that you've talked about. How can we interrogate qualitatively using case study work, whatever we can, to try and be able to get a much better handle on how these projects are working in real time. Now that is, there's a footnote that's anathema for people trying to do randomized control trials. That violates one of the canonical, almost biblical principles of what you're supposed to not do when you're doing an RCT type of intervention. It's called the unit homogeneity assumption, which is that everyone receives exactly the same intervention, and you mess with that at the peril of the integrity of your whole project design, right? So this particular type of way of saying, yes, mess with your project, change it all you want, adapt it in real time, right? It's not going to get you published in any fancy journal, at least maybe over time it will come to be, but the nature of what we're trying to do with these kind of interventions is to be able to explicitly recognize this heterogeneity, explicitly recognize this diversity, this heterogeneity of impact across different demographic and geographic places, and to be able to then make those real-time adjustments to learn from the project itself, rather than from outside evaluators coming in with the fear of God imputed to them to be able to make big claims about whether things are working or not. Which is why I said at the start that I think the experiential side of implementation is so underappreciated, because I think that's where people who have been doing this for a long time, even if they can't formally articulate it, I think potentially have a really good sense about whether these things are working or not. And we need to figure out how to be a little more formal with that in terms of building it into the very way in which we implement and design our things. So that's just one summary slide for some other stuff, but basically the point is that as the external validity of a lot of these things, by the time we get over here on the far right, where we are working with highly complex interventions, where the quality of implementation is likely to be particularly low, and where the contextual compatibility is very questionable, then the default assumption should be, I think, really the external validity of whatever we found somewhere else should be assumed to be zero. And then in accordance with that space, that these process evaluations, mixed methods, and case studies become just only more important to the extent that we find ourselves working in this space up here. And I think for a lot of the work that I think that you guys are doing, and certainly what I'm doing, we need to recognize, we need to be able to engage with the politics of ideas around this stuff much more formally than we have been able to so far. We think we've got to, become a square peg in someone else's round hole. We think we've got to comport with someone else's logic, because that's the way that a particular dominant, dare I say, hegemonic way of thinking about this stuff has come to take hold within the powers that be that allocate money, that they're the gatekeepers to making claims about impact. And as I said with the opening quote, that's fine, but I think for about 10% of the problems we actually face in development, 90% of what we're really worried about are these much more vexing, much more complicated, interventions where there's a high degrees of causal density, where context compatibility is central, and crucially where the quality of implementation is vital to delivering whatever it is that we ultimately claim as the impact, and being able to fully exploit the array of human knowledge we have across the social sciences to be able to help with that both in the design, the implementation and the evaluation phases, I think is what we really need to be directing our energies to over the next little while.